There is a moment, usually somewhere between the 10th and the 14th day, when something in you goes quiet in a way it has never been quiet before. Not empty, not numb. Quiet the way a room feels after a storm has finally passed and the windows are still rattling faintly from the wind that used to be there. You do not notice it arriving. You notice it has already arrived. The way you notice a scar has healed only when you run your finger over it and feel nothing. You are about to learn why that day matters more than any other day in the 21 you are given. But to understand day 14, you first have to understand day 1. And day 1 rarely feels like anything at all. It feels like an ordinary Tuesday. It feels like a decision so small you almost forget you made it by lunchtime. Somewhere tonight, someone is lying awake replaying a conversation from 6 years ago, still losing the argument in their head. Somewhere, someone is standing in a kitchen at midnight, eating something they promised themselves they wouldn't eat, telling themselves this is the last time, the way they told themselves last time. Somewhere, someone is staring at a ceiling, exhausted, wondering why they keep circling back to the same fears, the same doubts, the same tired script, as if their mind were a record with a scratch in it that keeps skipping to the same 4 seconds. None of them are broken. That is the first thing you need to release tonight, gently, like setting down something heavy you didn't realize you'd been carrying. You are not broken. You are trained, and what has been trained can, with patience, be retrained. There is an old observation, older than any single teacher who ever said it aloud, that the mind does not resist change. It resists uncertainty. Give it a new pattern, repeated with enough consistency and enough belief, and it will follow that pattern as faithfully as it followed the old one, because the mind does not actually care whether a habit serves you. It only cares that the habit is familiar. Familiarity to your nervous system feels like safety, even when the familiar thing is slowly costing you your peace. This is the quiet architecture behind 21 days. Not a magic number, not a spell, a window of time long enough for a new signal to become louder than an old one. If you are willing to send that signal without flinching, every single day, especially on the days you don't feel like it, tonight you are not here for hype. You already know hype. Hype burns bright and dies by Thursday. You are here for something slower and something far more durable. Stay with this a moment. Notice how your shoulders have already begun to lower, just slightly, just from the pace of these words. That is not an accident. That is your body remembering that it is allowed to be calm. Let's begin. The core principle is this, and it is simpler than you expect. Though living it is not simple at all. Your mind does not obey your intentions. It obeys your repetitions. You can want to be calm and still lose your temper by Thursday. You can want to be disciplined and still find yourself back in bed at noon, wanting lives in the future tense. Repetition lives in the present tense, and the present tense is the only tense your nervous system actually understands. There is a difference between deciding to change and training yourself to change, and almost everyone confuses the two. Deciding is an event. It happens once, often in a moment of pain or clarity, usually late at night or early in the morning, and it feels enormous. Training is not an event. Training is a series of unremarkable repetitions that individually feel like almost nothing. You will not feel dramatically different after day 1 of retraining your mind. You may not feel dramatically different after day 7. This is precisely where most people quit, not because the method fails, but because they were waiting for a feeling that was never going to arrive on schedule. Growth beneath the surface is invisible for longer than we are comfortable with. Modern psychology has a name for part of this. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition and weaken through neglect. In much the same way, a path through a forest becomes clearer the more feet walk across it, and fades back into brush the moment it's abandoned. Every time you rehearse a fear, you deepen that path. Every time you rehearse a doubt about your own worth, you deepen that path. And every time, without exception, you choose a new thought, a new response, a new action, even a small one, you begin cutting a different path through the same forest. At first, the new path is faint. It requires effort to find. But paths do not stay faint if you keep walking them. 21 days is not about willpower in the way most people imagine willpower, as some finite reserve of grit you either have or don't. It's about consistency low enough in intensity that you can sustain it, and high enough in frequency that your mind cannot dismiss it as a fluke. You are not trying to overpower your old patterns in a single dramatic confrontation. You are trying to outlast them, quietly, day after day, until the new pattern is simply what's there when you reach for a thought. There is a kind of humility required here that our culture rarely teaches. We are taught to admire the breakthrough, the overnight transformation, the single decisive moment. But the truth, the one almost no one wants to hear at first, is that most lasting change looks boring while it's happening. It looks like brushing your teeth. It looks like making your bed. It looks like choosing for the 11th day in a row to breathe for 4 seconds before you respond to the email that made your chest tighten. Nobody applauds day 11. Day 11 is when the actual work happens. Say this quietly to yourself if it feels true. I trust steady progress even when I cannot see it yet. Let this sink in before we go further, because everything else tonight will build on it. There is another layer beneath repetition, one that explains why some habits take root almost effortlessly while others seem to slide off you no matter how hard you try. It has to do with identity, with the quiet story you carry about who you are, running beneath your conscious thoughts like a current beneath the surface of a river. You can tell yourself on the surface that you're trying to become someone calmer, someone more disciplined, someone more at peace, but if the deeper story you carry still insists, I am someone who overreacts, I am someone who gives up, I am someone who doesn't deserve ease, that current will keep pulling you back toward the shore you're trying to leave. This is not mystical thinking. It's simply how self-image functions. Psychologists have long observed that people tend to behave in ways consistent with how they see themselves, even when that behavior works against their stated goals, because the discomfort of acting outside your self-image creates a kind of internal friction most people resolve by reverting to the familiar version of themselves, however unhappy that version makes them. This is why 21 days of action matters more than 21 days of intention. Every time you act differently, even in a small, unglamorous way, you are not just changing a behavior. You are quietly editing the story you tell yourself about who you are. And a story, edited enough times with enough evidence behind it, eventually becomes the truth you believe without needing to argue for it anymore. You do not need to believe the new story fully on day one. You only need to be willing to act as though it might be true and let the evidence accumulate. This is not self-deception. It is simply how every person who has ever changed has changed, one piece of contradicting evidence at a time, until the old story could no longer hold its shape against the weight of the new one. Marcus Delgado had worked the overnight shift at a distribution warehouse outside Phoenix for 6 years, moving pallets under fluorescent light from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. And somewhere in those 6 years, without quite noticing when it happened, he had become a man who snapped, not violently, just sharply, a short fuse that had gotten shorter with every passing year of exhaustion, every missed dinner with his daughter, every argument with his wife, Renata, that started over something trivial, a dish left in the sink, a comment about money, and ended with him saying something he regretted the moment it left his mouth. He knew the pattern. That was the strange, painful part. He could see it happening in real time, like watching himself from a few feet outside his own body, and still he couldn't stop it. His inner dialogue, on the nights it got bad, sounded something like this. Here it comes again. Don't do this, and then he'd do it anyway, because the thought arrived half a second too late, always half a second behind the reaction it was supposed to prevent. It was his daughter, Camila, who was 9, who finally said something that lodged itself in his chest like a splinter he couldn't work free. She'd asked him, in the flat, curious way children ask devastating questions, whether he was always going to be grumpy, because her friend's dad wasn't grumpy. Her friend's dad played board games and didn't yell. Marcus didn't answer her that night. He went out to the garage, sat on an overturned bucket in the dark, and let himself feel for the first time in a long time exactly how ashamed he was. He didn't have a therapist. He didn't have money for one, not with the mortgage and Camila's school fees, and for a long time that felt like the end of the story, like there was nothing to be done except keep being the man he didn't want to be. He'd tried, in scattered ways over the years, to will himself into patience, promising Renata after every bad night that it wouldn't happen again, and meaning it every time, and breaking that promise every time too, until the promises themselves had started to feel hollow, even to him. But a coworker, an older man named Theo, who ran the forklift on the opposite shift, mentioned something to him one night during a break, almost in passing. Theo said that a few years back he'd rewired something in himself, not through therapy, though he thought therapy was good for people who could access it, but through a stubborn, unglamorous commitment to catching himself every single day for 3 weeks straight. Theo called it training his temper the way you'd train a muscle. Reps, he said. It's just reps. He also said something Marcus didn't fully understand until much later. That willpower alone had never worked for him, because willpower run at full strength for 6 years straight will always eventually snap, but a small, specific, repeatable action done consistently doesn't rely on willpower the same way. It relies on structure. And structure doesn't get tired the way a person does. Marcus started that Thursday. His method was almost embarrassingly simple. Every time he felt the heat rise in his chest, the tightening in his jaw that came right before the words he'd regret, He made himself do one thing. He touched his thumb to his forefinger, a small physical anchor, and counted backward from 5 before he said anything at all. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Sometimes the anger won anyway in those first days. He snapped at Renata twice in the first week, and each time he felt the old shame flood back in, temptation to think, see, this doesn't work. You're the same, you'll always be the same, but he kept going. Not because he felt hopeful, because he decided almost stubbornly that 21 days was a small enough commitment that quitting would be more embarrassing than continuing. By the second week, something had shifted subtly, the way weather shifts before you can name what's different about the air. He noticed the heat rising in his chest a full second earlier than before. That extra second was everything. It was the gap where the old response used to live automatically, and now there was a sliver of space, a place to choose. By day 19, Renata said something to him at dinner, not knowing about his private experiment, that stopped him mid-bite. She said he'd seemed different lately, softer, and asked if something had happened at work. He almost told her everything right then. Instead, he just said he was working on himself quietly, and let it be enough for now. I choose calm over fear. Say it if it fits you tonight, the way Marcus eventually said it to himself, not as a magic phrase, but as a small compass he returned to again and again until it stopped feeling like a phrase and started feeling like the truth. 6 months later, Camila asked him to play a board game on a Sunday afternoon, and he did for 2 hours, and nothing about that afternoon was extraordinary except that it happened, and that a year earlier it might not have. Noticed how your breathing has become slower since we began. Stay with this thought for a moment. The same gap Marcus found between provocation and reaction, that thin sliver of space where a different choice becomes possible, exists in you too right now. Whether or not you've ever noticed it before, there is a stillness available to you right now, in this exact moment, that does not depend on your circumstances changing first. Notice that. Most of us wait for peace the way we wait for a bus, standing at the edge of our lives, checking the horizon, assuming it will arrive from somewhere outside us, on its own schedule, when we've finally earned it. But peace, the durable kind, the kind that survives a hard Tuesday, has never worked that way. It has always been closer than the horizon. It has always been available in the same breath you're taking right now, if you're willing to stop reaching past it towards something further away. There is an old teaching, repeated across generations in different words but the same shape, that the quality of your days is decided less by what happens to you and more by what you rehearse in the space between what happens and how you respond. That space is narrow. For most people, it's almost invisible, a crack barely wide enough to notice. But it is real and it is yours. And 21 days of returning to it again and again is how that crack becomes a doorway. You do not need to fix your whole life tonight. You only need to notice, gently, without judgment, where your mind goes when no one is asking anything of it. That drifting place, that default setting, is the truest map you have of what's been trained into you. And maps, unlike fate, can be redrawn. Breathe slowly for a moment. There is nowhere else you need to be right now except here, inside this sentence, inside this quiet. Elena Whitfield taught 7th grade English at a public school outside Columbus, Ohio, and for 11 years she had been good at her job in the specific, exhausting way that meant no one worried about her because she never let them see the cost. She was the teacher who stayed until 6 grading essays, who volunteered for the extra committee, who smiled through the parent-teacher conferences, even when a parent raised his voice at her over a grade she hadn't even assigned. She had built, without quite meaning to, an entire identity around being fine. The anxiety had been there for years, low and constant, like a hum beneath a room that you stop consciously hearing but that never stops costing you energy. It got worse the January her mother was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 3 states away, and Elena found herself lying awake at 2 a.m. doing math she couldn't control. How many more years? How many more good years? How many trips she could afford to make? How much of her sick leave she'd already used? Her internal dialogue on the worst nights was relentless. You should be doing more. You're failing her. You're failing your students. You're failing everyone. And underneath all of it, quieter but somehow louder than the rest, a fear she rarely let herself finish. What if you're just not enough for any of it? She started having what she eventually described to her sister as breathing problems that weren't really breathing problems: tight chest, shallow air, a racing heart during ordinary staff meetings about nothing in particular. A doctor told her kindly that it was anxiety and prescribed something, and Elena took it for a while and it helped some, but she still felt like a passenger in her own mind, watching it spiral without a hand on the wheel. It was a school counselor, a woman named Priya, who Elena had lunch with occasionally, who mentioned something almost offhand one Friday afternoon, the two of them eating quickly between periods in the small windowless office Priya used for meetings with students. Priya talked about how the anxious mind isn't lying to you exactly, it's just running an old program, an outdated alarm system built for threats that don't exist anymore, calibrated by an ancestry that once needed to react instantly to a rustle in the grass, and that the alarm can be recalibrated slowly through deliberate practice, the same way you'd retrain any overactive system. She mentioned almost as an aside that the mind doesn't actually distinguish very well between a real threat and a remembered one, which was why replaying an old argument could still raise Elena's heart rate years after the argument itself had ended. The body, Priya said, keeps responding to the rerun as though it were live. Priya suggested something specific. For 21 days, every time Elena caught the spiral starting, she would not try to stop the thought. She would instead say, silently, "This is my mind trying to protect me," and then name 3 things that were true and neutral in that exact moment. The chair is blue. The window is open. My hands are warm. It sounded almost too simple to Elena, and for the first several days it felt like nothing, a small ritual performed against an enormous fear, like trying to hold back a flood with a dish towel. She kept a tally on a sticky note in her desk drawer, a small tick mark every time she caught herself and did the exercise instead of spiraling. By day 6, there were 11 tick marks. By day 6, she was also crying in her car before school most mornings, because the practice hadn't made the fear disappear and some small, exhausted part of her had expected it to. What happened around day 13 surprised her, though it wasn't dramatic. She was in the middle of a lesson. A student had said something unrelated that reminded her, out of nowhere, of her mother, and she felt the familiar tightness begin in her chest, and before she'd even consciously decided to, she found herself thinking, "This is my mind trying to protect me," automatically, the way you'd catch a falling object without deciding to reach for it. The thought had become a reflex, not the fear disappearing. The response to the fear quietly rewired. "I become stronger every day," she wrote on a new sticky note, replacing the tally, somewhere around day 16, and she meant it not as wishful thinking but as an observation, the way you'd note that a plant had grown an inch. Her mother's condition did not improve. That part of the story doesn't have a tidy resolution, and Elena would tell you that herself. What changed was not her circumstances. What changed was the 18 inches between her ears, the space where she used to live in constant emergency, and where she now most days lived in something closer to steady attention. She still visits her mother every month. She still grades papers until 6 some nights. But she no longer wakes at 2 in the morning doing math that has no answer. She sleeps mostly. And when she wakes anxious, which still happens, she has somewhere to put it that isn't a spiral. If you ever feel ready to explore ideas like this more deeply, there is more waiting for you below, whenever you're ready. And not a moment before, notice, for a second, how your breathing has slowed since you began listening. This isn't coincidence. It's the same principle Elena discovered, in miniature, happening to you right now. Repetition, even gentle repetition like this, begins recalibrating the nervous system almost immediately. You don't have to force calm. You only have to keep returning to it the way you'd keep returning to a friend's voice in a crowded room. There is a story about Benjamin Franklin that is often reduced in the retelling to a neat little productivity trick, but it deserves more patience than that. In his early 20s, Franklin, dissatisfied with his own inconsistency, his temper, his pride, his tendency toward idle talk, decided on an unusual project. He identified 13 virtues he wanted to cultivate in himself, things like temperance, order, sincerity, humility, and rather than trying to master all 13 at once, which he correctly guessed would overwhelm him and guarantee failure, he chose to focus on one virtue per week, tracking his lapses in a small book with a grid of dots, one column for each day. What's easy to miss in the popular version of this story is how honest Franklin was about his own repeated failure. He did not master order on his first attempt. By his own account, years later, he found himself far more deficient in that particular virtue than he had expected, constantly relapsing despite his best intentions, his desk perpetually cluttered, his schedule perpetually disrupted by the unpredictable demands of his printing business. He kept at it anyway, cycling back through the 13 virtues again and again across years, not weeks, treating the entire project less like a test he could pass or fail, and more like an ongoing practice, the way a musician returns to scales not because they expect to someday finish needing them, but because the returning is the point. What made Franklin's approach durable wasn't a single burst of resolve. It was structure repeated with enough humility to survive his own failures. He didn't quit the project when he found he was still, after months, forgetting his goal of orderliness. He simply noted it, without excessive self-punishment, and returned to the practice the following week. There's something worth sitting with in that. He treated his own imperfection as information, not as evidence that the whole endeavor was doomed. By the time Franklin was in his later years, the habits he'd built through that long, imperfect, repetitive process had become simply who he was, inseparable from his character, no longer requiring the daily grid of dots, because the grooves had become deep enough to hold their own shape without conscious tending. He wrote, later in life, of feeling grateful for the attempt even where it had fallen short of perfection, noting that a person who merely aims at excellence and keeps returning to that aim despite repeated failure ends up a far better person than one who never made the attempt at all, if only because the returning itself becomes its own kind of character. There's something worth borrowing from this for your own 21 days. Franklin didn't need to succeed completely to benefit enormously. He needed only to keep returning, week after week, year after year, to a practice he believed in, even when the evidence of his own dots and lapses suggested he still had a long way to go. The return was the practice. The perfection was never the point. It's worth pausing here to say something plainly, because it's easy to hear stories like Franklin's or Wilma Rudolph's or even Marcus's and Elena's and quietly conclude that you simply have more willpower to summon, more discipline to locate somewhere inside yourself. That conclusion, understandable as it is, misses the actual mechanism at work in every one of these stories. None of them relied on a heroic, sustained act of willpower. Every one of them relied on making the practice small enough, specific enough, and repeatable enough that willpower barely needed to be involved at all. Franklin didn't try to become perfectly virtuous overnight. He tracked one virtue at a time in a small book with dots. Marcus didn't try to become a patient man in a single conversation. He touched his thumb to his finger and counted to 5. The size of the action matters far less than most people assume. What matters is whether it's small enough to survive your worst days and repeatable enough to still be standing after 21 of them. This is worth remembering the next time you're tempted to design an elaborate, ambitious plan for changing your mind, complete with a rigid schedule and lofty daily goals. Elaborate plans rarely survive contact with an exhausted Tuesday. Small, specific, repeatable actions do. Choose the smallest version of the practice you're considering, the version so modest it feels almost silly, and trust that modest, sustained across 21 days, will outperform ambitious, abandoned after 4. There is an old teaching, found across many wisdom traditions in slightly different form, about a farmer who plants a particular kind of bamboo. For the first year, nothing visible happens. He waters it faithfully, nothing. The second year, he waters it again faithfully, and still nothing breaks the surface of the soil. The third year, the same. The fourth year, the same, and by now his neighbors have started to comment, gently at first, then less gently, suggesting he's wasting his time on a seed that clearly isn't going to grow. He keeps watering anyway, some say out of stubbornness, others say out of a quiet trust that the visible and the real are not always the same thing. Then, in the 5th year, within a span of weeks, the bamboo grows 60, 70, sometimes over 80 feet into the air. The teaching isn't really about bamboo. It's about what was happening underground during those 4 seasons of apparent nothing, where the plant was building a root system wide and deep enough to support the growth that would eventually happen fast, once it happened at all. Nothing about those 4 years was wasted, even though nothing about those 4 years looked like progress from the surface. The visible transformation was only ever the last chapter of a much longer, quieter story that had been unfolding the entire time unseen. This is worth remembering on day 9 or day 14, when nothing about your own effort seems to be showing on the surface yet. You are, very possibly, still underground. That is not failure. That is what root systems look like while they're forming. There is a particular kind of doubt that tends to arrive right around this stage, somewhere in the 2nd week, when the novelty of beginning has worn off and the reward of finishing hasn't arrived yet. It sounds, in most people's heads, something like a quiet, reasonable-seeming voice suggesting that maybe this isn't working, maybe you're the exception, maybe other people can rewire themselves, but something about your particular circumstances, your particular history, makes you different. This voice can feel like wisdom. It rarely is. It is usually just the old pattern, sensing competition for the first time in years, and doing what any threatened pattern does, which is argue for its own survival. You are allowed to notice that voice without obeying it. Noticing is not the same as believing. Daniel Okafor had been a widower for 14 months when the story that matters here really begins, though the truth is his wife Igioma's absence had been shaping every day since, in ways he was still discovering, the way you discover a bruise by pressing on places you didn't know were tender. He was 39, worked as a customer service manager at a regional insurance office outside Charlotte, and was raising two children, Toby, who was 11, and Ade, who was 7, largely alone, since his own parents were still in Nigeria and Ijioma's mother, though present when she could be, had her own health to manage. Grief for Daniel had not looked like sadness so much as a kind of fog that made ordinary tasks feel impossibly heavy. He forgot things. He forgot a client meeting entirely in his 3rd month back at work, something that had never happened to him before Ijioma's death, and had to sit through an uncomfortable conversation with his supervisor about focus, a word that felt almost cruel given what he was carrying. He snapped at Toby over homework in ways that frightened him afterward, not because he was cruel, but because he simply had nothing left in reserve most evenings, and his patience, once generous, had worn down to almost nothing, like a tire driven too many miles past its tread. His internal dialogue at night, after the kids were finally asleep, was often just one repeated phrase, quiet and merciless. You are failing them, you are failing them, you are failing them. What finally moved him wasn't a single dramatic moment, but a small one that undid him anyway. He found 3 weeks after her passing a drawer in Ijioma's dresser he hadn't yet had the strength to sort through, and inside it, among scarves and old letters, was a half-finished list in her handwriting titled simply, Things I Want Daniel to Remember for the Kids. It wasn't a dramatic document, it was practical, almost mundane. Toby likes his sandwiches cut diagonally, not straight. A Daisy is scared of the vacuum cleaner. Always warn her before you turn it on. Read to them even when you're tired, especially when you're tired. He didn't open that drawer again for months. But something about that list stayed lodged in him, a quiet accusation and a quiet invitation at the same time. And eventually, at the urging of a grief support group he'd started attending reluctantly at his sister-in-law's insistence, he decided to try something small and specific for 21 days. Every night, no matter how exhausted he would spend 15 minutes doing one thing from Ijioma's list, or something in its spirit, and he would say one sentence to each child before bed, something true and specific he'd noticed about them that day, not generic praise, something real. You listened so patiently to your sister today. You worked hard on that math even when it was frustrating you. The first several nights felt hollow, forced, like reciting lines in a play he didn't believe in. He was tired in a way that made even 15 minutes feel like an unreasonable demand. On day 5, he almost quit, sitting in his car in the driveway after work, telling himself he'd start again next week, when he had more energy, which was, he now recognizes, exactly the kind of thinking that would have let the whole practice quietly die the way so many good intentions do. He went inside anyway. He said the sentence to Toby anyway. It didn't feel meaningful that night. It just felt like discipline for its own sake. Around day 12, something in Toby shifted, unprompted. His son, who had gone quiet and withdrawn since his mother's death, started talking again at dinner, small things at first, a joke from school, a complaint about a classmate, and then one evening something larger. He told Daniel he'd been scared that his dad was disappearing too, not physically, just somewhere inside himself, and that lately it felt like he was coming back. Daniel had to leave the table for a minute to compose himself in the bathroom, running the water so the kids wouldn't hear him. I trust steady progress, even when I cannot see it yet. He found himself thinking without having planned to, somewhere around day 16, and it startled him how much he meant it. By day 21, the practice had stopped feeling like a practice at all. It had simply become an evening, the shape his days took now, the 15 minutes and the one true sentence as automatic as brushing his teeth. He still grieves. He will likely grieve in some form for the rest of his life, and there was no 21-day method that was ever going to erase that, but he is unmistakably present for his children in a way he had genuinely feared he'd lost the capacity for, and a Daisy, who is now 8, still asks him most nights, unprompted, "What's my true thing today, Dad?" and waits, patiently, for him to notice something real. There is more below if you want to keep building on what you've started tonight, whenever it feels right for you. Wilma Rudolph was born in rural Tennessee in 1940, the 20th of 22 children, into circumstances that offered her almost nothing in the way of advantage. She contracted polio as a small child, along with scarlet fever and double pneumonia in the same difficult stretch of early childhood, and doctors told her family she would likely never walk normally. For years, her leg was held in a brace, and she made regular, arduous trips with her mother to a hospital more than 50 miles away for treatment, because no closer hospital would treat a black child in that place and time. What isn't often emphasized in the shorter versions of her story is how long and unglamorous her recovery actually was. It wasn't a single turning point. It was years of her mother and siblings massaging her weakened leg daily, years of the brace, Years of small, repeated physical therapy that produced almost no visible change for long stretches at a time, much like that bamboo beneath the soil. She didn't walk without the brace until she was around 9 years old. She didn't run competitively in any serious sense until her early teens. By 16, she had made the United States Olympic team and won a bronze medal in the 1956 Melbourne Games as part of a relay. That alone would have been a remarkable story for someone who was told as a small child she might never walk. But 4 years later, at the 1960 Rome Olympics, she won 3 gold medals, becoming the first American woman to do so at a single Games, in the very body that doctors had once doubted would function normally at all. What made this possible was never a single miraculous moment. It was thousands of unremarkable repetitions, stretches and exercises, and short training sessions that, individually, looked like almost nothing, sustained across more years than most of us are willing to sustain anything, especially anything that doesn't show quick results. Her own family later described the daily massages of her weakened leg as routine, almost dull, the kind of task woven so thoroughly into ordinary life that no one in the household thought of it as remarkable while it was happening. It was simply what they did, every day, the way you might describe brushing your teeth, and it was precisely that unremarkable, undramatic consistency, repeated across years rather than weeks, that eventually produced a body capable of outrunning every other woman at the Olympic Games. The gold medals were the bamboo breaking the surface. The actual transformation had been happening invisibly for over a decade before that. You are allowed to be in your own invisible decade, or your own invisible 3 weeks, right now, without needing proof yet that it's working. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from the mental noise of constantly negotiating with yourself about whether to do the thing you already know you should do. Should I get up now or in 10 minutes? Should I respond calmly or let myself say what I'm thinking? Should I keep going tonight or give myself a pass? Just this once. That negotiation, repeated dozens of times a day, is exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with the actual difficulty of the task itself. It is decision fatigue, and it is one of the quiet reasons 21 days of consistent practice tends to feel lighter, not heavier, as it goes on, once the pattern has grooved in deeply enough that it stops requiring a vote every single time. This is part of what almost no one tells you about self-mastery. The goal isn't to become a person with infinite willpower, gritting your teeth through every choice for the rest of your life. The goal is to reduce the number of choices that require willpower at all, by making the better option automatic enough that it no longer feels like an option you're negotiating, it simply feels like what you do. Marcus didn't count backward from 5 forever. Eventually, the space between provocation and calm response closed almost entirely, because the new pathway had become the path of least resistance, the way a well-worn trail through a forest becomes easier to walk than pushing through the underbrush beside it. There's a reason so many people, in the middle of trying to change, describe feeling worse before they feel better, and it has nothing to do with the method failing. Old patterns, when they sense they're being replaced, don't simply step aside quietly. There's often a strange intensification right in the middle of the process, a kind of last resistance, where the anxious thought gets louder for a few days before it gets quieter, where the old temper flares more sharply right before it starts to soften. This isn't evidence that you're going backward. It is more often evidence that the old groove is losing its grip and reacting the way anything does when its usual dominance is finally being challenged. If you find yourself in that stretch, somewhere around day 8 or day 12, feeling like the discomfort has intensified rather than eased, you are not failing. You are very likely closer to the shift than you realize. I release what no longer serves me. Let that settle for a moment, however it applies to you tonight, whether it's a habit, a fear, a way of speaking to yourself that you inherited from somewhere you didn't choose. There is also a spiritual dimension to consistency that deserves honesty rather than platitudes. Faith, in almost every tradition that has thought seriously about it, has never meant certainty. It has meant continuing to show up, to water the seed, to say the sentence to your child, to count backward from 5 before you have proof that it's working. That is, in fact, the entire definition of trust, action taken before evidence arrives. Wise people across generations have understood this in different language, some calling it grace, some calling it discipline, some simply calling it showing up, but underneath the different words is the same quiet architecture, the same 21 days, the same invisible root system, the same trust that what you tend will eventually, in its own time, become visible. You do not need to feel spiritually certain tonight to begin. You only need to be willing to keep watering something you cannot yet see growing. I am becoming who I choose to be, one day at a time. Say it if it's true, or say it until it becomes true, which, more often than we admit, is how most true things start. There's a quiet difference between saying words and meaning them, and it's worth naming honestly. The first few times you say an affirmation like this, it may feel false, even a little foolish, especially if the story you've carried about yourself for years says otherwise. That gap between what you're saying and what you currently believe is not a sign that the practice is dishonest. It's simply the distance between where you are and where you're walking toward, and distance is only ever closed by walking, not by waiting until it feels comfortable to start. Wise people across generations have understood that the voice inside you responds less to how true a thought feels on day one, and more to how often it's repeated by day 21. There's a specific kind of grief that belongs to the version of yourself you've been for years without meaning to be. The tired version, the reactive version, the anxious version, the version who snapped or spiraled or gave up early again and again, not because that self was who you really are, but because it was who repetition had trained you into becoming, one unnoticed rehearsal at a time. You're allowed to grieve that version gently, without cruelty toward yourself, the same way Marcus eventually forgave the version of himself that snapped at Renata twice in his first week. The same way Elena forgave the version of herself crying in the school parking lot before she'd found her footing. The same way Daniel forgave himself for the nights the grief simply won. None of them became perfect. That's worth saying plainly, because perfection was never actually the promise, and any story that promises it is lying to you. Marcus still has short-tempered days. Elena still has anxious mornings. Daniel still grieves his wife in ways that will likely never fully resolve. What changed for all three of them wasn't the disappearance of difficulty. It was the quiet, cumulative effect of 21 days spent building a different relationship with that difficulty, a groove deep enough that the better response became, at last, more available than the old one. You began tonight, whether you realized it or not, the moment your breathing slowed, the moment you let a sentence land instead of rushing past it toward the next one. That was day 0, if you want to call it something. Tomorrow can be day 1 if you choose it. Not because tomorrow is magic, because tomorrow is simply the next unremarkable repetition, and unremarkable repetitions, it turns out, are the only real material transformation has ever been made of. There is no need to plan all 21 days perfectly tonight. You don't need a complicated system, or the right notebook, or the ideal time of day. Marcus used a touch of his thumb to his finger. Elena used a sticky note in a desk drawer. Daniel used 15 minutes and one true sentence. What they shared wasn't the method. It was the willingness to return to something small deliberately, on the days it felt like nothing was happening, trusting a process they couldn't yet see the results of. That willingness is available to you tonight in exactly the same measure it was available to them. No more required, no less. Remember Camila, waiting at the table on a Sunday afternoon for a board game that almost didn't happen. Remember Toby finally saying at dinner that his father felt like he was coming back. Remember the bamboo, invisible for 4 years and unmistakable in the 5th. Whatever you plant this week will very likely feel like nothing for a while. Water it anyway. If any part of tonight felt like it was speaking directly to something you've been carrying quietly, there is more waiting for you below. Whenever you're ready to go further, and not a moment before then, you can close your eyes now if you're somewhere safe to do so, and simply notice how different you feel than you did when this began. Not transformed, not finished, just slightly quieter, slightly steadier, slightly more willing to believe that 21 ordinary days, lived with a little more attention than usual, might be enough to change the shape of the years that follow them. They usually are. Ret well tonight. Begin gently tomorrow. That is all this has ever required of you.